Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This video is a response video, and it was requested by a group of YouTubers who are once a month they pick a topic and everybody makes a video about that topic. And I'm going to engage in that dynamic because it's a good idea. People can learn quicker, bigger, more information can get out. And then what'll happen is just once a month a topic will get picked. And what I'll do is, because the structure of my channel, I'll just put that video into this as a request video. So this is a request video about the topic of peasants or commoners. And this video is going to overlap with some previous videos like the uprising videos, the Kumazawa videos, the Jisamurai videos. All of these videos are going to be sort of we're going to go over those videos in this video, but we're just going to quickly go over it. But to begin, let's start by just saying that we got to do away with the concept of peasant. Even the English word peasant, it brings to mind too many Western concepts. We really should be using words like Hyakusho. But for the sake of the viewer, we're going to use the word peasant. But during the course of the video, I'm going to remind you of why that's a poor tool to use to understand these concepts. And I'll try to introduce you to some other words which will help you to better understand the concepts. So like I said, in a previous video, we discussed something called Hyakusho, which means peasant or commoner, but it's more used for farmers. Check out the Country Samurai video. We went into depth on that one. The difference between Samurai Bon Hyakusho and Hyakusho. We can also use the word Shonin for merchants, right? So when you're saying peasant, you have to be like, well, what are we talking about? We're just talking about non-imperials, non-samurai, right? So you're talking about farmers, you're talking about merchants. So then say Hyakusho for farmer, say Shonin for merchant. And then, because remember, as a Shonin, well, as a Shonin is part of a shoka, a merchant house, right? And then we have things like during the Edo period, these merchants would form these guilds, right? You'd have shokas, the houses, but then multiple houses could combine to form a powerful guild, right? And there is one guild called the Kabunakama that was endorsed by the Edo Shogunate, the Edo period shogunate, the Tokugawa Shogunate, to operate business operations for the shogunate, even to the point of setting prices, right? And I mentioned this in a Kumazawa video, and we'll talk about it a little later in this video. But that's a problem. That actually is a huge problem. But so that's a significant amount of power. So if you're saying, oh well, peasants in Japan had no power, that's not true. Okay, the Kabunakama, which is a nakuma, which is a guild built from the shoka, the merchant houses, they had a ridiculous amount of power. These guys had more power than your average samurai. You got your average samurai got this much power. Well, these merchant houses had more power than them in many cases. And then even the term Kabunakama comes from the term nakama, right? So nakama, you see it on your screen, two kanji, naka-ma, right? Nakama. And that originally referred to a samurai's attendants, right? So like the samurai's peasant attendants, so peasants, the non-samurai attendants of a samurai, nakama. But during the late Sengoku and into the Edo period, it comes to refer to these guilds, and we'll go into this a little bit later about that linguistic transition. But these quote-unquote peasant guilds, right, that attended the samurai by running the business operations. So for example, the merchants, so originally nakama referred to the non-samurai attendant to a samurai, but then nakama comes to refer to the guilds that attend to the samurai's needs or to the shogunate's needs. Do you see the connection? So these guys had power. Now I do have to take a moment to clarify something. In the previous slide, I'm saying nakama, and it comes from this concept of samurai attendants. But you need to understand, I wasn't very clear on this, and later on in the video I will refer to this again, but I'm not very clear, so I've inserted this slide. When I'm saying nakama, I'm specifically talking about the guilds, and it coming from the term of samurai attendants. You need to know that when you're talking about samurai attendants, the word is chugin. So nakama, that pronunciation of nakama, that is specifically for guilds, and chugin is a samurai's attendant. So you can write chugin with the kanji for nakama. You can also write it with a slightly different version, understanding chugin, but it means the same thing. So you can either use nakama or you can use chugin. Both can mean samurai attendants, but you pronounce it chugin. So for guild, it has to be nakama, that set of kanji. But for the chugin, it can either be the kanji used for nakama, but it can also be chugin, which is a slightly different way of writing it. The important point here is that it is conceptually related. The reason that the kanji are so similar is because it is conceptually related. What I want you, the viewer, to understand is this concept of chugin and this concept of nakama being conceptually the same thing. The idea is that these are the non-military, the non-samurai, the non-warrior attendants for the samurai. So the samurai is like he's the military knight, and then he has the civilian attendants. Whether it is chugin or nakama, that is the concept that is conceptually linked. No video about the sort of peasants of Japan would be complete without going over the Edo period class, or the Edo period model of society. The Edo period model of society is nothing more than a continuation of the main ideas and the main trends of the pre-Edo Japan. But one needs to understand that to sort of reflect on the rigidity. See, pre-Edo classes were very fluid, and that's why using the word peasantry is a bad word. It's a poor choice of word to discuss the citizens pre-Edo, right? So anyway, but here's the terms, right? Okay, so you have the gentry, you have agriculture, which stands for farmer, you have labor, which stands for artists, craftsmen, builders, construction workers, etc. And then you have selling, which represents the merchants. So let's move on. But anyway, I have to show that just to make sure that everybody's familiar with that. That's the official classes of the Edo period built on the roles of society pre-Edo. Then you have another term for peasant, which is heimin, and then that is kind of a generic term, right? But it's basically composed of two kanji for hei, which means peace, and then min, which min is the real word. Min is the actual word for commoner or citizen, right? Or for peasant. And you'll see it lower on the screen. That's the actual real kanji for peasant, and then the one over would be for samurai. And that's usually how you see it, as I say, on the screen. You see it in older documents and domain documents, which are like records and registers and stuff, peasants and samurai. But now you have to be very careful, because I have seen people make the following mistake. You'll see in red, you see the kanji in red? That means officer and soldier. That means the officers and the soldiers. That means the samurai and the ashigaru. It does not mean samurai and peasants. So if you're reading an old document and it's talking about, like this part here, when dealing with ronin, ashigaru, and goshi, you may sometimes see a record or document refer to them by various terms, which might be confusing. So there's one such term as outside of the officers, and it looks like it's saying outside of the samurai, but it doesn't mean peasant. What it means is outside of the domain samurai. It can mean anything from ashigaru to ronin to goshi. So when you see officer and soldier, that is discussing, when that is the terminology used in the document, you then have to be very careful how you're reading the document, because it's not referring to peasants at all. And I've seen people make this mistake before. So I need to be very clear. We're talking about non-military peasants and samurai, and by samurai we're also referring to ronin, ashigaru, goshi, etc., etc. So the red kanji where it says officer and soldier, that's technically included within just the kanji for samurai. Does that make sense? What we're really talking about here is peasants, which are like construction workers, artists, merchants, farmers, and the samurai, which with under samurai we're containing officers and soldiers, ronins, ashigarus, goshis, etc., etc. Okay, that makes sense? So therefore, 99% of the time when we're talking about peasants, the language clearly uses terms like hyakusho or min, that single kanji for peasant. So now let's keep it simple, right? What do you, the viewer, what do you need to understand? You need to understand that prior to the Edo period, the class system wasn't a solid system. Many of the viewers are aware of this. You had the Imperial Court and you had the rest of society. So this is a viewpoint. This is a Gengundan viewpoint. This is a Kumazawa viewpoint. This is a Southern Court viewpoint. And I'm trying to introduce it to you because it really helps to understand this mechanic. You have the Imperial Court and then you have the rest of society. From the Imperial Court comes the samurai. You can almost say like the Imperial Court bleeds into the rest of society via the samurai, right? The samurai, the extension of the court, right, into the mass population. The samurai are the extension of the court, all right? And by the court, I mean the imperial family and the court family. Because remember, when we say imperial court, we're talking about the emperor's family, but we're also talking about the court nobles. Everyone else, you're either the imperial family, you're the court noble family, or you're a samurai family. Everyone else is a peasant, which means 90 to 95% of the country is peasantry, or is non-imperial, non-samurai, non-court noble, etc., etc. Okay? So the best way to look at this is the imperial court and the gentry families that stem from it, and the rest of the people. 90% of the people are farmers, merchants, artists, construction workers, etc. Okay? Then you also have another big section of society that were monks and nuns, Shinto priests, shrine maidens, etc. And all of the religious workers are considered their own class. And they're often exempt from taxes. So you have the imperial court and its extensions, aka the court nobles and the samurai, which is like a small percentage of the population. Then you have like 90% of the population is quote unquote peasants. And then you have a small chunk of the society of the total population are monks and nuns and priests and shrine maidens, etc., etc. Right? 90 the mass majority bulk of Japanese history and culture is quote unquote peasant, right? Which is why the concept of peasant is not a correct, and it's not a very effective tool to navigate and understand the history. So according to Gengundan teachings, right, and Southern Court teachings, etc., etc., the following is the correct way to view it. You have the imperial court, and then you have the people. Not using the word peasantry, but using the word citizen, using the word the people, right? The population, the country, 90% of the country have the people. So you have the imperial court, and then you have the people. And you will see this view, this belief continue in persons associated with the Gengundan, even into the Edo period. And one of those, for example, being Kumazawa Banzan, who I am currently doing a video series on. If you've seen those videos, you understand his writings. You have the imperial court, and then you have the people. The reason the samurai are gentry is the only reason the samurai are gentry, the only reason that they even exist, okay, is because they are biologically related to the emperors and the court nobles, and they are the needed extension of the imperial court into the land. So you've got the emperor, and the emperor gives rise to the court gives rise to provincial governors, the provincial governors gives rise to the local government, the kokujin, the local leaders. The local leaders have their retainers, and then their retainers sometimes are full-blown military with the genealogies. Sometimes they're country samurai, aka they are commoners who are knighted because they need to have more samurai in that area. And then you also have militarized peasants. It's all about a system of government. It is literally just that simple. It's about the imperial court spreading through the country to maintain order and to serve the needs of the people. The emperor is there to be the emperor of the people. So the emperor has to govern the people. The samurai, the shugo, the kokujin, the samurai, they're all extensions of the government. 90% non-government, 10% government. So the imperial court spreads out among the people. That's 10% of the country spreads out into 90% of the country. 90% of the people, that is 90% of Japanese history and culture, is coming from the quote-unquote peasants, which again is why I say thinking of them as peasants is wrong. It's bad. It's ineffective for actually navigating the history. You should really call them the citizens, the people, the citizens. That kanji you see on the screen, that means the people, the citizens, the average people, the 90% of the people doing the living and dying, right? 90% of the tasks that need to be done for the country to function as a country is done by the people, the non-government people, right? So in pre-Edo times, from the people could arise new samurai. Members of the citizens can be brought into the imperial government structure. They can be knighted, to use a Western term, right? This is because the imperial government needed more samurai, right? Because people die, new territories are expanded into, and they're like, we need, some more members of our government. So you can then take a commoner, a normal citizen, militarize them, give them government position, knight them, then boom, now you have a new samurai. And that was pre-Edo. That's how it worked. Without the people, the imperial court has no one to rule over, and there is no infrastructure to support a country. The emperor needs the people. Like, the people need the emperor, but the emperor needs the people. If there's no citizens to govern, then there's no government, right? There's nothing, right? If without the people, there's no construction companies, there's no merchants, there's no farmers, there's no artists, there's no clothing makers, there's no shoemakers, etc., 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 right? Do you remember earlier in the video when I mentioned nakama, the samurai attendants, and then that term goes on to mean the guilds, right? The idea is that the samurai's assistants were citizens who helped the samurai by supplying the needed infrastructure to the samurai. When a samurai needed craftsmen, he got a citizen. When he needed to buy something, he had a citizen. When he needed people to farm his fields, he got citizens to farm the fields. Right? Some samurai, some ji-samurai during the pre-Edo started off as farmers. They were farmers that became knighted. But once they're knighted, they then have duties. They have military duties and government duties. So then they have to get assistants and farmers to do the work for them. You see what I'm saying? So the samurai needs an extension. The samurai needs non-samurai extensions to get his job done. And that's the concept of nakama. Okay? And then in the Edo period, you'll see that term, that concept, it becomes the guilds, as I mentioned earlier. But again, all right, we're talking about 90% of the population. So the government is serving 10% of the people is serving 90% of the people. This is very important to remember these numbers. Okay, so hopefully you as the viewer is like understanding the sort of importance and power of the 90% of the citizens, right? What that means. And then at this point we're going to ask, well, what went wrong? Like, why is the stereotype of the poor peasant? Like, where does that come from? When we talk about like Japanese peasantry, why do we think of, like these poor, dumb, dirty people, And the quick answer to that is from movies, right? From movies. But why do the movies have the stereotype? Why do books and movies have these stereotypes? Where did that come from? And then we can show where that's going to come from. I'm going to get into that. But so along the way, of course, I'm going to make you listen to a lot more. So you'll get the answer, but I'm going to have to talk to you a lot more before you get the answer. But let's start in on that. In pre-modern times, life was just hard, okay? So even though these citizens had power and they had the social mobility and many of them had middle class or wealthy status, it's just modern times are hard, man. There's natural disaster. Japan is a land of natural disasters. Okay, there's lots of, natural disasters in Japan, even today, even in modern times. And then you have government mistakes, government mishandling of projects, and then you have pre-modern medicine. So people are getting sick and dying of things that they don't get sick of and die of now. You know what I mean? Mortality rates are high. And that has nothing to do with power or wealth or influence. That's just pre-modern times were hard. You also had warfare, and as Sun Tzu warns, warfare, it takes a massive toll on the citizens. Every time there's a war, it's going to cause strife and just problems among the citizens. All right, and then kind of as an extension of the warfare, as samurai armies became larger and the government became decentralized, there's less and less sort of answering to society done by the various samurai factions. In the Southern Court teachings, they say this is when the samurai truly lost their way and became the problem, right? Power-hungry warlords were willing to do whatever in order to gain power. Abuses done to citizens increase over time, right? This going into a village and just taking what you want and then just burning the village and raping the women and whatever, et cetera, just dragging people off to be slaves and whatever, just doing all these horrible things to the citizens. That became more and more common as the government became decentralized and started to fall apart. However, that did come with its own reaction, and this is going to lead us into the uprisings and the riots. Now, I did an entire video on this in great detail, so we're not going to go over it perfectly. We're going to gloss over it. Most uprisings and riots, these things that people call the ikis, etc., there's a great misunderstanding about them. So, again, if you want the good detail, go find my uprisings and riot videos. Otherwise, we're just going to give a brief summary here. These uprisings and riots were actually started and conducted by the Kokujin and the Jisamurai, and they use militarized citizens as the majority of the force behind the riots. Now, this is pre-Edo, because the way that a riot was conducted in the Edo period is very different. We'll get to that in a second. So pre-Edo, it's a massive group of militarized citizens led by Kokujin and Jisamurai, right? Led by samurai. So there's at least one or two. It may only be one or two. It may be a small group of samurai, but there's a small group of samurai with a massive group of militarized peasants. And they just, when conditions were poor and people got pushed around too much, they would rebel. Massive groups of militarized peasants would get behind a group of samurai and attack whichever group they believed were responsible for their hardships. That's how the uprisings and the riots took place pre-Edo. Now, in the Edo period, it's very different. Village chiefs would have to submit a formal complaint to the shogunate, and then those village chiefs, upon submitting the complaint, were oftentimes tortured and executed, but the complaint usually led to the samurai in charge being dismissed. So even though it might cost the village chief his life, he could literally in other words, the village chief could get the local government official fired, dismissed, seppuku, etc., by submitting the formal complaint. But the trade-off is that he would have to be executed in order to file the complaint. So even though this means that the village chief who files a complaint has to die, it means that the citizens have considerable power. Just imagine for a second. Okay, now let's go back and let's think about both types of uprising. In the pre-Edo period, warlords were always afraid that there would be an uprising. Now let's take a minute just here in parentheses. We haven't even really talked about uprisings led by temples and shrines, so let's do that just for a second. The temples and shrines, and remember, the temples and the shrines are in their own sphere. They're outside of the normal legal political lines. They have their own class system, if you will, right? They have a ridiculous amount of freedom and social mobility. Oftentimes, they never even paid taxes, and they could often, in the snap of a finger, organized large mobs of militarized citizens to force warlords or government officials to bow to their demands. So that was a major factor. And warlords in the pre-Edo period, the warlords were afraid of these uprisings because overnight there could just appear a massive group of militarized citizens, and they were able to defeat armed samurai groups. They were a true threat. Now during the Edo period, it was not that anymore, but the daimyo and the local officials were still afraid, absolutely afraid, that a village chief might forfeit his life and file an official complaint. And then when that complaint was filed, it almost always, not always, but often, usually, it meant the end of that official's career, which could include everything from seppuku to that official's family being, the whole family being dismissed. So it's very important that the viewer understands that what, people loosely call quote-unquote peasants, again, 90% of the population, and they had a lot of power, all right, and they really should not be called the peasants. They should just be called the Japanese citizens, the average citizens of Japan. And you should do away with these sort of negative connotations of peasant. You should really just brush away the word peasant and just replace it with citizen, or non-government citizen, right? Like in modern days, we have the military and then you have civilian, right? So citizen or civilian, right? The civilians. Peasantry, the civilians, right? So military families, civilian families, you got military and you got civies, right? So it's very similar to that. You should really not think of them as peasants, but you just think of them as the citizens or as the civilians, the civilian population. Some were poor, but many were middle class or wealthy. Some of the merchants had more money than the local samurai officials. Just like in modern times, some private citizens have far more money than the government officials have, right? Like the richest people on the planet are not government officials. They're civilians, okay? So you really need to understand this, and you have to understand that the quote-unquote hard life of a peasant, it wasn't due to peasants being dumb and poor and uneducated and just sad human beings. It was due to natural disasters, government mismanagement, warfare, pre-modern medicine, because pre-modern medicine is not really that good, possible sanitation issues in some instances, etc., etc., etc. It's the vast majority of what made life hard for peasants was just pre-modern times were hard to live in. Now let's take a moment to focus on government mismanagement, because this is a big topic. It's a big topic in the Jingunden. It's a big topic in Kumazawa. Okay? When the class system became official in the Edo period and everyone is locked into the class systems, because remember, pre-Edo, it's fluid. Yes, you have these roles in society, but you can fluidly move back and forth. But in the Edo period, bang, it's all locked in. So once that happens, the citizens are stuck in their respective roles. And this killed most, now not all, but most. Not all social mobility was killed. Most social mobility was killed. So that's a big factor. Then on top of that, the Edo Shogunate, the Tokugawa Shogunate, was a very poor government. Mismanagement and overall piss poor ability to handle basic government functions led to strife not just among the citizens, but among everyone. The Imperial Court suffered, the samurai suffered, the peasants suffered. The hard times that the peasants had in the Edo period was a hard time for everyone. The Tokugawa Shogunate was both an incompetent government, and they also believed in disempowering the citizens and disempowering the samurai. The shogunate was willing to ruin its own people to maintain control. So that's a big factor. So some examples of that. Let's bring up those trade guilds again, right? By allowing the trade guilds to operate without any government oversight or very little government oversight or very little regulations. The trade guilds were, the Tokugawa Shogunate just were like, well, merchant activity is for the merchant class. You guys just handle it. And the trade guilds did. But the problem was is the merchants controlled way too much, and they formed mafia-like guilds. And some of the viewers may remember a long time ago on a previous channel, I used to talk about samurai using shinobi arts to go to war with the trade guilds. I used to talk about this a lot. Nobody wanted to hear me, so I stopped. But this is where this comes up. Because these trade guilds were so powerful, they were like mafia organizations, and they were a problem for the local samurai officials. And so they had to actually conduct in so many ways. Like, for example, you could use shinobi techniques to like spy on the trade guilds and figure out what illegal things they're doing, you know, etc., etc., etc. Some of you may also remember when I used to talk about the Inada clan and that entire Indigo Merchant Guild ordeal. So I won't go into that now, but I have in the past talked considerably about this issue. But because it's a very important issue, the trade guilds being allowed to operate as freely as they were means two things. One, it means that these quote-unquote peasants were incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy. So right here, where the trade guilds disprove anybody that thinks that, you know, peasants in Japan were poor and dumb and uneducated means that they don't know a thing about the trade guilds. The trade guilds were ace. They were powerful, they were educated, they were wealthy. They were literally an enemy for the local samurai governments. And even from there, from a previous video I discussed, merchants were able to purchase the right to wear two swords and live as pseudo samurai due to that nakama nature of their guilds. Any ideas of you having of peasants being not powerful and being dumb and poor, you can throw all that out the window. The merchant trade guilds were effectively, they were not samurai, but they were equally as powerful and deadly and a problem for the local samurai governments as if they were a rival samurai group. Some other issues that caused for the peasants was that the shogunate failed to regulate currency, and it failed to set a constant countrywide rate for rice value. This, and I put this in red because this is important, this failure on the government's part led to mass starvation in some parts of the country. Also, the shogunate bound the hands of the daimyo and forced the daimyo to be in constant debt. So, we'll just keep going on. The shogunate also forced the daimyo to have to clear too many things with Edo and disallowed the daimyo to freely engage in projects as needed. So this means that many infrastructure issues went unresolved. So, like literally, things that would have been handled in the pre-Edo time period by the daimyo were not allowed to be handled during the Edo period. So you have massive starvation because of mismanagement of money. You have infrastructure not being worked on because the government won't give the permission, right? And then let's not even get into the tax issue. Taxes were a literal nightmare. The tax rates sometimes going up as high as 60% in some cases, right? And it was this. Now I want you to read the last line in red. Because of these kinds of things, right, the citizens of the Edo period suffered considerably, and it was usually the ones living outside of the cities, outside of the urban areas, are the ones that suffered more. And this is where the stereotype of the poor country bumpkin peasant is born from. This is really where this comes from. Because of the mismanagement of the Tokugawa Shogunate of the citizens, you actually had more poverty, more starvation, just overall more poverty and more starvation due to the mismanagement of the Tokugawa Shogunate in the Edo period that actually caused the citizens that were living outside of the urban centers to suffer more than they might have prior to the Edo, okay? Because they had a lot more mobility. There was a lot more freedom to get shit done. But now their hands are tied and they're starving. And the government's just incredibly screwed up. And this is really affecting the suburban and the non-urban peasantry, the non-urban citizens. And this is where some of these stereotypes of the dumb farmer or the dirty farmer, the country bumpkin peasant, it really starts to be born from this reality of the mismanagement during the Edo period. So, please don't think of Japanese pre-modern citizens as poor peasants or dumb peasants. They were 90% of the population, and the vast majority of modern-day Japanese people come from them. Most of the things that people love about Japan came from these citizens, not from the samurai. The Jingunden teaches that the welfare of the citizens is the sign of a correct government, right? So if the citizens are doing well, then the government is doing well. If the citizens are suffering, then the government is failing. People like Kumazawa Banzan wrote documents. See, I have a video series about it. You can go watch the video series if you want the details. But Kumazawa Banzan, even in the Edo period, right, against the Tokugawa Shogunate, he's laying out and explaining how the government is failing the citizens. Right? Kumazawa actually even suggested that the samurai class should re-merge with the farmers. In other words, it should go back to the Jisamurai days of the pre-Edo period. The quote-unquote poor peasant concept is a bad stereotype that arose from the mistreated citizens living outside of urban areas during the Edo period and who suffered from the shogunate's incompetent governing policies.